Today on Let the Bible Speak.
Does the Bible give us signs that indicate Jesus is about to return? Stay with me for that study next on Let the Bible Speak.
From the Churches of Christ, Let the Bible Speak with Kevin Presley.
And welcome. Thanks for joining me today for Let the Bible Speak. I hope this is the beginning of what will be a great week for you, and you're starting it in a good way by pausing to study the Word of God. In fact, there's no more important thing that we could do today. I want us to look at a topic that is of great interest in our time, and that is the second coming of Jesus. And specifically, does the Bible give us signs that Jesus is about to return? When Jesus left this world, the angel declared that he would one day come again, and Jesus promised his return several times during his ministry. Well, are we quickly approaching the time when Jesus will come again? Does the Bible give us any idea as to the times in which he will return? Well, you don't have to look very far to find preachers and others who claim that we are now living in the end times. They claim that the events we see unfolding in the world today all point to the imminent return of Christ. Earthquakes, fires, floods, political upheaval, and civil unrest, the viral spread of immorality and godlessness, we're told they all point to the skies and the rapid return of Jesus. But is that the case? Now, make no mistake, he will indeed come again, and we're to always be ready, for he could come soon, he could come today, he could come at any time. But are there signs that point to the timing of his coming? In Matthew chapter 24, beginning in verse 1, the Bible reads, "And Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him for to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said unto them, See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of thy coming, and of the end of the world?" He then goes on to enumerate a number of signs and indicators that the things he is speaking of were about to take place. But was he talking about his second coming? Well, you might be surprised by the answer, and I'll return with that study in a moment.
Connect with us on social media. Go to Facebook.com and search for Let the Bible Speak TV.
Often here we are filled with such sorrow when loved ones are taken away. But there's coming a happy tomorrow. We'll join them in heaven to stay. Till the Lord comes, we'll keep on believing and trusting the Lord all the way. When the trumpet shall sound, we'll believe.
The conversation recorded in Matthew chapter 24 took place during the final week in Jerusalem before Jesus' crucifixion. As Jesus left the temple, his disciples came to him to show him the beautiful buildings of the temple. Herod's temple was indeed a wonder to behold, and it was a matter of national pride to the Jews, including Jesus' disciples. Jesus, however, knew what was about to unfold that week in Jerusalem. The people would soon be calling for his crucifixion, and with this rejection of their Messiah, they would be sealing their fate as a nation. The city of Jerusalem, including the temple and the religion that it represented, would be destroyed by the hand of God as a new covenant with a new Israel was established through Christ's death. God would pour out his judgment through the Romans who would invade Jerusalem 40 years later and destroy the city. So as they proudly pointed out the beautiful buildings of the temple to Jesus, Jesus startled them with words prophesying its doom. He said, beginning in verse 2, "See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down." Well, this was a stunning prediction. It was difficult for them to imagine any event except the end of time itself that would result in the destruction of the temple. And so verse 3 says that as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, "Tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world?" Now the disciples asked Jesus three questions. Number one, when shall these things be? What things? Well, the destruction of the temple, which Jesus described in verse 2. Second of all, they wanted to know, what will be the sign of thy coming? Now Jesus had at different times during his ministry told them of his return and of the end of the world. And so when Jesus now prophesies the destruction of the temple, they thought that that must be when the end of the world would come, because they then asked, what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? Now, the word world translated here could also be translated age. But in the minds of these Jewish disciples, the destruction of the Jewish temple must mean the end of everything, the end of the world, the end of time itself. But Jesus carefully dispels this notion and shows that the event he is referring to in verse 3 is not the end of time, but the end of the temple and the sacrifices and ceremonies of the Jewish religious economy that went along with the temple. Now, it is my belief that Jesus first addresses the timing of the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, and then later in this discourse, he turns his attention to the final judgment and the end of the world, again much later in the chapter. Thus, the signs and prophecies found in a major portion of Matthew chapter 24 have really nothing to do with the end of time and Jesus' second coming, but rather have to do with the things that would take place in the 40 years between the death of Jesus and the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. Now notice carefully how Jesus walks them through a series of events. Look, beginning in verse 4, he says, "Take heed that no man deceive you, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that ye be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in divers places. All these are the beginning of sorrows." These things, you see, would be taking place during the time after his ascension, causing them to wonder if the end was at hand. But notice that Jesus says these things do not signal the end. Now, although it would be easy to think that God's judgment was on the verge of being poured out during such tumultuous and uncertain times, well, Jesus says those things would occur, and they would not signal the impending end of the temple. Now, you know, today people get all excited about things that they see on the news, such as natural disasters, political upheavals, world disorder, and they say that these things mean that we're living in the end times, that we should see them as signs that Jesus is about to return. But the things Jesus mentioned here in Matthew chapter 24 had nothing to do with his second coming, and they didn't even mean that the destruction of Jerusalem was at hand, because he says the end is not yet. All the things that Jesus lists are things that are documented to have taken place all throughout the first 40 years of the gospel age throughout the Roman Empire. In fact, when Jesus spoke these words, There was generally peace throughout the Roman Empire, but within a short amount of time, things began to change, and there were insurrections and uprisings and conflicts flaring up in Palestine and throughout the empire, and the Jews, being subject to the Romans at this time, they were kept in a state of uncertainty and turmoil due to the unrest taking place throughout the world. In fact, throughout the 400, what we call silent years, or the 400 years of the intertestamental period, if you trace that, there was a lot of political upheaval involving the Jews and them being dominated by one nation and then another and then back to this nation and then another. And there was all kinds of unrest for hundreds of years that was setting the stage for the first century and the conditions that allowed the Messiah to be born and that allowed the spread of the gospel message throughout the world. But all of that unsettledness brought eventually a time of peace while the Romans were in control when Jesus actually was born and when he lived. But just like it had in the past, that was going to change. There were going to be wars and rumors of wars in the near future. Now, Jesus also mentions earthquakes and other such disasters, and indeed a number of famines and pestilences and major earthquakes were documented throughout Judea during that period of time. Palestine, Asia Minor, and Europe experienced those kinds of things during that same time. And just as Jesus said, the uncertainty and anxiety that these events would create in the minds of people would make them vulnerable to men who would then arise and claim to be the Messiah, there to save the day, to save them from the turmoil surrounding them. And he said that many would be deceived. Well, it's not unlike our own day when preachers and so-called prophets go about predicting the end of time because of the supposed signs they see appearing. Jesus said not to be deceived by such. But now Jesus was a true prophet, and the things that Jesus predicted here in Matthew 24 were not to take place in our day and time, but long before. They were to take place in their day and time, in the first century, between the ascension of Christ and the fall of Jerusalem 40 years after that. And Jesus says for them not to be alarmed or unsettled by those things when they hear of them, that they were not signaling the end. And he even says much worse things, so far as they were concerned, would happen before the end came. Continuing in verse 8, he says, all these are the beginning of sorrows. Then shall they deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you, and ye shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. And then shall many be offended, and shall betray one another, and shall hate one another. And many false prophets shall rise, and shall deceive many. And because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. But he that shall endure unto the end, the same shall be saved. Well, this describes the whole period of time documented throughout the book of Acts and the epistles. This is exactly what happened to the apostles and many within the early church as it faced opposition from the Jewish leaders and from the Roman government eventually. The blood of martyrs freely flowed as persecution erupted in Jerusalem, starting in Acts chapter 7, and spread throughout the Roman Empire as Christianity expanded throughout the world. And such persecution presented many Christians with a great temptation to forsake the faith. But Jesus says, they who endure unto the end, the same shall be saved. Now we know that's a true statement for Christians of any age, spiritually speaking, but what was Jesus referring to on this particular occasion? You see, Jerusalem's destruction in AD 70 would bring with it, according to Josephus, the slaughter of 1.1 million Jews. But no Christians died in the siege. Why? Well, you see, because Jesus warned them, and he told them when and how to escape. If they had failed to believe Jesus and turned back to Judaism, they would have been among that awful number who died when Titus invaded the city. So these warnings and predictions have nothing to do with the end of time. They have to do with the end of the Jewish age, the end of the temple, and the end of Jerusalem as God's holy city here upon this earth. Now then, he says these things will all come to pass, but the end will not come yet. Notice what he says must first happen. Verse 14. He says, and the gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come. Jesus says the sign that the end is ready to come, the thing that will precede the end of that age or the end of the temple, is that the gospel will be preached to the whole world. Now someone says, see there, this must be talking about the end of time because the world continues and there are people in the world who still have not heard the gospel. But here we must let the Bible respond. Look at what Paul wrote to the church at Colossae, in Colossians chapter 1 and verse 26. He says, if ye continue in the faith, grounded and settled, and be not moved away from the hope of the gospel which ye have heard, and which was preached to every creature which is under heaven, whereof I, Paul, am made a minister. Now, Paul wrote that in the 80s, near the time of the destruction of Jerusalem, and just as Jesus said would be the case before the temple was destroyed, Paul says the gospel had indeed been preached to the whole world at that time. We know that in Acts chapter 2, on the day of Pentecost, there were Jews in Jerusalem out of every nation. Thousands of them were baptized, and they doubtlessly carried the gospel with them back to their homelands. So immediately the gospel began to spread throughout the world. And thus Paul said, by the time soon before Jerusalem was destroyed, the gospel had been preached everywhere. Now Jesus said that after this took place, that's when the end or the destruction of Jerusalem would come. Now that is a precursor to the impending judgment about to be poured out on Jerusalem. Jesus says they need to be watching. Look now at verse 15. Continuing on, he says, when ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place. Whoso readeth, let him understand. Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house, neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. And woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. But pray ye that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day. For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. Jesus says when the gospel has been preached everywhere, then be watching for the abomination of desolation that Daniel had prophesied about hundreds of years before. What does he mean by the abomination of desolation? And what was the prophet Daniel talking about? Well, the word abomination means something detestable. And it was often used in the Old Testament to refer to the things pertaining to pagans and idolatrous worship. Now Luke, in his account of Jesus' prophecy, tells us exactly what this abomination of desolation would be. Luke chapter 21, beginning in verse 20, says, and when ye shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. Then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let them which are in the midst of it depart out, and let not them that are in the countries enter therein too. Now the armies would be those led by Titus, armies of Roman soldiers who would approach and encircle the city and finally invade it. They would think of their arrival as the abomination of desolation because the Romans were heathens and pagans carrying their ensigns of the Caesar and pagan emperor worship, and that would be abominable to the Jews. And so the arrival of the Roman armies would mean the desecration and destruction of the beloved in their eyes and in their eyes still holy temple. So Jesus said to the disciples, when you see this abomination of desolation, when you see the Roman armies approaching, flee to the mountains. In other words, get out and away from the city so that you're not caught in the bloodshed and the destruction. That's why he says, don't mess around. Don't stop to go back and get your clothes and other possessions. Pray that this won't happen in the winter when fleeing into the mountains would be difficult. The horrific tribulation that Jesus speaks of in verse 21 refers to the unspeakable horrors that unfolded in Jerusalem when the Romans invaded. The streets of Jerusalem became a river of blood. Read Josephus, the Jewish historian's account of the destruction of Jerusalem. It's chilling. So many Jews were crucified by the Roman soldiers until they ran out of wood to build crosses. Josephus pictures that period as the most bloody and violent siege in the history of Jerusalem and in the history of the world. And Jesus is giving his disciples warning before it happened and telling them that the destruction of Jerusalem, all of these buildings of the temple, would come down. It would leave the temple in ruins and the old religious economy it represented in the ash heap of history as a new and a better way was about to be unveiled after Christ's death and resurrection. Now, friend, the fact is the Bible gives no signs of Christ's second and final return. The early Christians were warned about the destruction of Jerusalem so they could flee and not be caught up in it. We're promised that Jesus will one day come again, but instead of being told what to look for so far as the times, we're told who to look for, and that is Jesus himself. In other words, we're to always be watching and waiting for his sudden return, when he will then stand before him when we will stand before him in judgment and receive the rewards of this life. That day is coming. But the Bible teaches it's going to come as a thief in the night. There will be no warning. And yes, it could be soon, it could be today, it could be tomorrow, it could be a year from now, but it could just as easily be 1,000 years from now. The Bible says a day is like 1,000 years with the Lord, 1,000 years as a day. And the fact is, if we would spend as much time and energy and interest preparing for Jesus' return as some do needlessly trying to decipher and predict the time of his return, we'd be a lot better off, and we would actually be prepared to meet him when he comes. Jesus went on to say in verse 36, "But of that day and hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only." Now here Jesus is answering the third question that the disciples had asked back in verse 3, and that is, when would the end of the world come? Well, after Jesus told them when the temple would be destroyed, he then says, "Of that day, in the day when I return to judge the world." No man knows that day, only God knows that day. And in verse 42, his admonition to them and to us as well, "Watch therefore, for ye know not what hour your Lord doth come." Now, Lord willing, in our next study together, we'll continue looking at the chapter and see what we might learn about Jesus' coming and judgment on Jerusalem, and also about his second coming to judge this world.
Subscribe to our YouTube channel to see all of our past broadcasts, plus extra videos including Let the Bible Speak classics all the way back to the 1960s. And get new updates, go to YouTube and search for Let the Bible Speak TV and click on subscribe. Connect with us on social media. Go to Facebook.com and search for Let the Bible Speak TV.
It's been wonderful to be with you today, and if you would like a free printed copy of our lesson, we'll be happy to send it to you. Simply ask for the lesson, Signs of the Second Coming, and it will be on its way. Don't forget, past videos and transcripts can also be found at our website, ltvstv.org. You can also sign up for our podcast. Go to Apple iTunes or to Google Play and sign up for the podcast. And recommend the program to others. Won't you tell them to watch or subscribe to our social media channels, and be sure to become part of our viewing audience from week to week. We appreciate your loyal viewership of the program, and if you're new to the program, we hope will make this a regular part of your week. We look forward to meeting you back here, if the Lord wills, for another Bible study. Until then, I pray the Lord will richly bless you.
Lord, I'm chosen as last calling.
the Bible Speak is brought to you by your friends in the Churches of Christ.